Today, I'm honored to welcome Richelle Flanagan, a dietitian with over 20 years of clinical practice, former president and CEO of the Irish Nutrition and Dietetic Institute, and a force of nature in Parkinson advocacy. Richelle's journey is remarkable. She noticed her own young-onset PD while she was 3 months pregnant with her daughter, micrographia while writing notes for her clients. And she hid her diagnosis for 2 years because of stigma, fears, embarrassment. But something changed and she stepped into the light. Driven the change to care, research, the outcome for people with PD, and especially women. She is now an ambassador for the World Parkinson Congress, co-founder of the Women's Parkinson Project, and co-founder of My Moves Matter app, a digital tool empowering people with PD and with other neurological conditions to track symptoms, hormones, medication, diet, exercise, and more. She co-authored key research papers, and she meets all the unmet needs of women with Parkinson, and she's on a mission to make dietetic care standard for all people with the diagnosis of PD. Richelle, she's here for me, she's here for you, and I want to thank you because she's making a major impact in Parkinson. Richelle Flanagan, thank you so much for being on my podcast and for making the time to be here.
I'm delighted to be here and thanks for asking me.
We will jump directly into the question. And, well, I would like to start by brainstorming on your career as a dietitian and a nutritionist, but also as a person who lives every single day with PD. So how has the diagnosis changed the way you operate, the way you also work as a professional, given your profession is so fundamental for Parkinson?
Yeah, I suppose, there's nothing like lived experience to really understand a condition. And, when you're counselling somebody else, you have a better insight of what they're struggling with. And I think with Parkinson's, it's about managing one's energy, and also there's so many symptoms to Parkinson's that people have to navigate and the fluctuations that happen, as the condition advances. And so it's not just a simple, eat more, eat well, move more sort of approach, it's a lot more complexity to that. And so that's given me much more empathy with regard to the people when I speak to them about how to manage their Parkinson's through diet.
How do you think of a discrepancy that exists still between, say, the fact that so many people know in PD that eating clean is important, anti-inflammatory nutrition, and the gut-brain axis, and yet it's so difficult to have access to a nutritionist, to a dietitian. So where that discrepancy happens, like why we don't have enough dietitian and nutritionists in a good team?
Do you have like a few days for me to answer this? So basically, before I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, I was actually the president and first CEO of my professional body, the Irish Nutrition and Dietetic Institute in Ireland. And I did a lot of advocacy around trying to get access for people with chronic disease to dietitians, because it's not just Parkinson's, across the board there is not enough access to regulated professionals. And we know that there's only 2 dietitians per 100,000 population in the world. So we're not going to solve it overnight, that's for sure. And I think, you kind of say, people know this about, clean eating or, anti-inflammatory. I would disagree. I don't think they do know. I think probably, the more educated, possibly, but actually I'm quite surprised. There's actually a lot of people who are quite educated and surprise me all the time how they follow completely unregulated, unevidence-based diets, which kind of get them into more trouble. So I think, it's kind of the basics that actually people, aren't aware of. And I suppose sometimes people get baffled by, big words and science, but actually, there's often not enough evidence behind those. But there's lots of evidence around, basic healthy eating patterns. But I think sometimes, people want, not to have to do the hard work to, be told to follow a particular diet or, take a particular pill and that'll solve it. But unfortunately, it requires a bit of input.
The magic pill.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you give me just an example of what do you mean? Let's say a regular diet, like the basics, and then those diet that do not have really evidences, but that are widely misunderstood and like they're widely actually believed. They're a way to go.
Well, I suppose, the people often ask about fasting diets and ketogenic diets, but there isn't enough evidence. I mean, there is animal, evidence for some of the fasting, but we know that animals don't translate mice straight into humans. I mean, it might give us an indication that there's something to look in humans, but we haven't seen research bear that out in Parkinson's. And again, in terms of going to the basics, if people actually just fast like one used to do in the old days, where you stopped eating at 7 in the evening and didn't eat again until 7 in the morning, research is showing that actually has benefit in terms of brain health. Where nowadays people are used to grazing all evening until the early hours of the morning. So that's, a big impact on people's brain health. And then in terms of the ketogenic diet, it sort of sounds, scientific and, because it's complex, therefore it must work. But actually all the research would show that the ketogenic diet is not really, showing the benefits that people are thinking that it does. All the research has been quite small numbers that it's been done in. And also there's been research about the ketogenic diet using supplements, keto supplements. But basically they've had to stop early because people can't stick to either the keto diet or to the ketogenic supplements because they're pretty horrendous.
The strict ketogenic.
But, for example, in the ketogenic diet is very impactful in epilepsy. That's where it's mainly used. But they have done modified keto diets, and that seems to be more acceptable, for obviously, kids or that struggle on the full keto diet. So I think if we took that approach more and actually looked at adapting ketogenic diet for maybe certain profiles of patients or people with Parkinson's, it might be younger people. It might be that there are certain people who have certain genetic forms that it might, but we don't have enough research to, to say that yet. And I think, at the end of the day, the best diet is the one that is sustainable, that, you like, you'll enjoy and you'll eat, on a regular basis. That's going to have the most long-term effect on your Parkinson's than something that's a one-hit wonder and potentially has a lot of side effects, one of which, big one, is losing weight, which has a very negative impact on Parkinson's outcomes. So, so I don't know if I went off piece there. But
No, great, actually, because I think you have been pinpointing directly to the complexity. Just, for example, ketogenic. I myself am aware of few studies that have really look at a ketogenic diet and then brain health, specifically in neurodegeneration. Yet sometimes they miss the complexity of the picture because at some point you just start giving a ketogenic diet, pretty strict, and so good fat, more fibers, and you clean sugars, processed food, inflammatory food. So obviously that if a person changes those patterns, they will see some benefits. But then just saying that that's then just the benefit of the ketogenic, it's questionable. I would say more, well, you just got rid out of all the, let's say, waste food and sugar and the inflammatory process. So, I would like to use your expertise today. So if you, say, had to talk with a person who is newly diagnosed with PD, how would you navigate that conversation about how to actually build a good nutrition that will help their progression and just energy, might impact also sleep and all that comes?
Yeah. Well, I suppose as a dietitian, we would often use food diaries with people to actually get an insight into what they're doing, on a regular basis. Because obviously when we see them, in clinic, you do a sort of a diet history and people would talk you through, what they're eating. But obviously they're trying to recall then and there. And that can be sometimes, open to interpretation. But when they do a food diary, and we generally sort of say do it for like 3 to 5 days and consecutive. So it'd be like a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because we always change our eating habits the weekend often. People sort of let it all hang out at the weekends where they're more, well-behaved during the week. So you're going to get a snapshot of what their behaviours are like. We do know that people underreport in food diaries by 25% because they don't want to tell the whole truth. Yeah. So I always say to people, you're only codding yourself if you don't tell the whole truth. And I think what's really powerful about those food diaries is that people get great insight. They suddenly realize, I didn't realize, I ate 10 biscuits a day, or I didn't realize I didn't eat any fruit, or I didn't realize, that actually, I'm up until 1 o'clock every morning, after the kids have gone to bed, doing X, Y, or Z. So I think it's about actually understanding people's patterns and, their way of living, and also gives them a lot of powerful insight, and that helps the behavior change, because they start to see, oh, I didn't realize I do that. I kind of say to people, it's like the bank balance. If you don't look at what's going in and going out of the bank, you can't balance the books. So it's the same with, your diet. If you're not actually looking at what you're doing, it's very hard to change it.
Well, I'm very glad that you're saying this, because in my coaching program, like I also at the beginning always ask them, please, nutritional reports. And it's like, how to track? It's like, I just want to know, what do you eat? Breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, all the foods, all the drinks. And then we analyze and together like, okay, this it's not good, this is okay. And like, oh, really? And it comes down to really realizing some, like we discussed also at the beginning, some common sense information, like how to clean and have like the basic or the fundamentals that are really strict and solid. And then from there, fine tune even more.
Yeah, I suppose like, the way I would approach it, and I suppose how we're trained around the behaviour change is that, and there is research to show it, that people often can't change more than 3 things at a time. So it's really about working with the person in terms of what they want to change, because if it's coming from them, they're much more likely to stick with it, So I might see in their food diary that, okay, the biscuits are a big problem. But from their perspective, it's like the elephant in the room. They don't want to touch that yet, but they're willing to, add fibre into their cereal in the morning. So, and that's a good thing, because it gives them a sense of, agency over their behaviour change. And they start to see, well, I can do that. And then their bowels might start to feel better. And so that means that their meds are going to feel better because they're going to the toilet more. So that means that maybe their medication is actually hitting their brain, so they're not, not getting enough, levodopa, which means that they're not craving the sugars. So it means that actually they start to naturally reduce the amount of biscuits they're eating, So it's kind of, it's working with where people are at and what's the first step they're willing to take, because
Slowly,
the thing that's the biggest thing that you could go in and say, that's the obvious thing we need to cut. If they're not ready to stop that, no matter what you do, they're not going to change.
I like this. It's like a trick to make them, understand how much power they have and get like the control over.
Yeah, and I think that's really, you think yourself, in terms of someone, think back to your mum, telling you what to do. Well, you did the exact opposite, So, and I think sometimes dietitians can, come across a little bit like that in our profession, a bit sort of, people are almost afraid to tell the dietitian. I always laugh, like in January over the years when I used to have clinics, people wouldn't book in until sort of mid-January to late January because they wanted to actually improve their diet before they saw the dietitian, which kind of is completely ridiculous, So it's about, not having a waggy finger approach. Yeah. It's actually understanding where someone's at and trying to work with them to make those changes. And that's much more satisfying for you as a practitioner, to actually see them, see the changes and actually kind of come back and say, oh my God, I feel so much better. That's feeling. That's really what we do it for, Yeah,
absolutely. You started mentioning also the impact of course, like our dietary behaviors and specifically the macronutrients with then levodopa absorption. In our audience, we have many people who are also newly diagnosed and some of them do not even have the information that protein, for example, and levodopa, of course, we know compete for absorption. So I always navigate, a very complex, of course, landscape of showing people that they should not be afraid of protein. It's just about timing. Yeah. And try to educate them of the importance of protein for also, for example, muscle mass as we age and as, also the progression of the disease. So what is your opinion on the best management for timing protein medication? And how many grams of protein per kilograms of body mass do you think it's ideal?
Yeah, it's not a straightforward answer. And actually this led us to write, I co-authored a paper on protein, whether to restrict or not, which anyone who's interested, it's a very good paper. The lead author was a dietitian who worked in Michael Okun's clinic in the US, or here. Actually, we're in the US, obviously, doing this podcast. And also with Ingi Subramanian, a neurologist, and Fiona Lithander, who's speaking at the Congress this week. And it was because I noticed one thing in particular. So when you separate the protein from the medication, yes, it helps to absorb more of the levodopa into the brain because it crosses at the same point. The amino acids cross the same point as the blood-brain barrier. So the amino acid is what the protein breaks down into. So just to clarify for people, that's your meat, chicken, egg, fish, dairy, etc. And also your non-dairy or your non-meat sources, your chickpeas, lentils, etc. So they break down into amino acids and they have to travel across the gut barrier and then up to the brain barrier, and then they compete at both places. But the main area that competes at, the amino acid compete at, is at the brain level. So I saw an awful lot of people who were struggling with their symptoms and realised that they weren't separating and they had never been told. And I thought, that's the most basic, item that we should be telling people. And the amount of people came back and said that just was a game changer for me. But actually, there was a number of people that I spoke with, and it seemed to be mainly women that were having a lot of dyskinesias. So that's a side effect of too much levodopa. So it's not a symptom of Parkinson's, it's a side effect of having too much of the levodopa in spills out. You don't have enough neurons to take it all in, so it spills out into your serotonin and that causes these extra movements. And we also know in terms of when people lose weight, they absorb more levodopa. And women, we know from the research, and something I've been banging on about for since I was diagnosed, that why do women have more dyskinesias? And we know now that women have potentially up to 3 times more than men. And part of that is to do with their metabolism, how they absorb the medication. It's to do with our body mass index, not necessarily weight, but the muscle to fat and water ratio. So in terms of women, they absorb more of the levodopa. So if you separate your protein foods from your levodopa, if someone's got dyskinesia, that's going to make it worse. Mm-hmm. So I was like, oh my God, it seemed so obvious when I sort of realized, but so that's not really something that's kind of considered. So in that case, for someone who has dyskinesia, they might have to, if they separate their meds from their meals, they might need to reduce the amount of levodopa they're taking, because by separating it, they're absorbing more of it. So maybe they don't need to take as much. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's a bit more complex. And I think also in terms of the amount, the research would show that generally speaking, people with Parkinson's should take about 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per kilo body weight. That is mainly to do with the interaction problem with protein and the levodopa. So because research, and we need more of these research studies to be repeated, because there's a number of them, but they weren't very robust or not very big. So we need, more of these studies to be done, because 95% of people are on levodopa, and 95% of people are dealing with fluctuations and interaction with protein. So we need more answers in that area. But anyway, so in terms of that amount, it was shown that people had higher levels of protein in their diet, so more than 1 gram per kilogram, needed more levodopa and had worse control of their symptoms. And that is just because it's interacting more with the levodopa. So they need more to get over. Do you know what I mean? Than someone who has, the 0.8 to 1 gram.
And do you think that a better time management strategy could help in that? Because when I hear 0.8 or just one, for me, from a performance perspective and aging, and a few other studies that have been done just in brain health, not precisely the Parkinson, that's way too low. Yeah.
So in terms of, certainly with regard to the aging population, we've seen that, it's, definitely more in the 1 to 1.2, maybe a little bit higher, because they don't, turnover of muscles is not as good, and they don't absorb, the amino acids as well. There's a lot of factors as you age. So that would definitely where we'd normally go with someone, the research is showing that. And obviously with younger people, they're going to need more than 0.8, to 1 gram. Now that is shown that that's enough. That will actually keep your muscle turnover in check. It's perfectly adequate to have. I'd probably typically go more towards the 1 gram as the base. And then obviously if you're exercising, we'd normally say to people that you'd have 1.2 up to 1.6 if you're doing, resistant training and you're doing for the 6 weeks, until build your muscle, and then you can bring it back down again once you've sort of, got that muscle mass on. So it depends on the individual. But with Parkinson's, because of the levodopa, it kind of messes it all up a bit. But there's some interesting, research recently with regard to people who've taken whey supplement protein. It seems to have not had, now that's along with exercise, it doesn't seem to have the same interference with the levodopa. And I was looking into this, I was like, why is this the case? And there's a couple of things. So, whey protein is it's more digestible. It moves through the stomach, quicker, and the digestive system quicker. So that obviously, helps in terms of getting the protein in quicker. And also then say casein, which is the other form of protein from dairy. And then the other thing is that the exercise helps you to take up the amino acids into your muscle. So the exercise takes the amino acids out of the blood, so you don't have as many of them competing at the blood-brain barrier. So the combination of the whey protein with the exercise, I think, is probably part of the key. And I think that's probably why exercise also benefits people with Parkinson's, because it's helping to metabolize the amino acids, so there isn't so much interference with the, so I mean, that's my own theory looking at, what the research is showing. So in that case, you possibly could go higher in your protein amount if you're exercising. If you're not exercising, maybe then you need to keep to the 0.8 to 1 gram. So again, it comes back to the individual. When we kind of need more, research to kind of actually look at this in more detail. And then you've got protein redistribution diets. So that's when people have a lot of interaction, they notice. So it generally happens when someone's taking maybe 4 medications, levodopa tablets, plus a day. So once they start getting to 4, so we say to people to time half an hour before a protein-rich meal, an hour to 2 hours after. But if you're taking tablets 4 to 5, 6 times a day, that becomes a mathematical nightmare. And, suddenly people start cutting out protein. And back to your point, that is really detrimental in terms of Parkinson's from the muscle point of view, keeping them strong, avoiding falls. We know the protein actually helps to produce dopamine. It gives you iron to, keep energy, so there's so many reasons why we should have protein. So the other option is to go for a protein redistribution diet where you have more of your protein in the evening time so that you don't have as much interaction during the daytime. And then you make sure you get your adequate protein in your evening meal. People always, want sort of a straight answer around protein, but
it's difficult.
It is more complex.
It's so subjective.
I think the other thing that kind of muddies the water as well is often when people are diagnosed first, and I noticed myself, I didn't have any issues with, interaction with meals because I had enough dopamine neurons when I was first diagnosed. So it kind of compensated for, I didn't notice on-off fluctuations. But as the longer you have the condition, you start to notice that because unfortunately we all, lose, and we know there's no thing to slow progression at the moment. Although I would say there are things that can help slow progression, but what I'm saying is that you can't stop it from, you can maybe slow it down over a time period. So that's kind of complicates people, they kind of go, well, I don't notice any interactions. So they don't necessarily need to time their meds separately as if they're not really noticing it. But I think sometimes getting in the habit of doing it means that they have that routine for when they maybe start to notice it.
Well, I think all these are very relevant input because even for people that already have the diagnosis, but even more for people who are newly diagnosed, even sometimes this information are not there and they're not getting them from all the clinicians.
No.
So just being able to ask this question or know where to go and find these precise inputs is of extreme relevance. So thank you for putting it also so clearly there.
Sorry, it was a bit long-winded.
No, it's great. And indeed, though, it makes me think also like 2 follow-ups questions. So one would be just if there is realistically also any difference between men and women when it comes even to protein intake and then muscle.
Yeah.
And then we'll pass also just to talk next to protein, the other big macronutrients. I really like to put the emphasis on fibers. But
yes. Yeah. So in terms of definitely, I mean, I think, research is beginning to show in general in say, I used to be big into sports nutrition because I played hockey myself at a high level. And so was very interested in, that whole sort of area. And so there's a lot of interest, in the impact of, hormones and cycles on athletes and also on, joints and tendons. And, so women get worse injuries around their menstrual cycle, because the hormones affect the loosening of the muscles. So there's a lot that we don't know about, protein and turnover in women, which I think has probably impacted much more around the hormonal cycles and what stage of life you are as a woman than a man, perhaps. And in terms of, obviously from a woman in Parkinson's, the biggest issue is this absorption of medications and the interaction with the levodopa. That's one of the biggest problems. And interesting enough, although I said that often we see dyskinesia as people have kind of the disease longer, I noticed from a lot of women, young onset women, that they actually, a number of them got dyskinesia within 6 months to a year of starting levodopa. I was going, okay, well, they're not advanced. They haven't progressed. They're early in their condition. Why have they got dyskinesia? And that's something I'm really passionate about, is there's something else going on there that we're not
grasping,
understanding. And I think it's very potentially hormonally related. But interesting enough, a paper came out, I just saw on LinkedIn, and it was to do with proteins in relation to the hormonal cycle and how they impact different conditions like endometriosis. And so I think, we're only scratching the surface in terms of being able to optimize women's health through, understanding the macronutrients better.
We'll come to all the big, complex topic of women and PD because it is very complex. But tell me, how about fibers? How many grams of also fibers per day should a person target?
So the first thing is, carbohydrate being the main, one of the main sources or, macronutrients for getting your fiber from. And I always think carbohydrates get such a bad press. People want to cut them out, for weight loss. But your carbohydrate it's the main source of energy to the brain. Now, there is an issue in terms of neurodegenerative conditions that we don't process the carbohydrates as well as people who don't have the neurodegenerative conditions like Parkinson's. But again, I think it's very interesting if people are exercising. That makes sense. It helps to overcome this, what they call type 3 diabetes, in terms of not being able to be more insulin resistant. And obviously exercise helps you to use your insulin better and to overcome that. So I think, there's lots of nutritional reasons why exercise is actually having benefit to people with Parkinson's in terms of their symptom control and potentially progression. I think there's a lot of nutrition metabolism reasons why that's happening, which we need a lot more nutrition, researchers to really delve into. I think we'd really benefit for having more research in the area. But coming then to the point of, so if you're not eating carbohydrates, you're not going to get your fiber because that's your main source of your fiber, So your carbs come from your breads, your pastas, your rices, and they come from your fruit and veg. So they're the main source. And if people are cutting out carbs and going to a high-fat diet, they're on a hiding to nothing. And actually quite interesting that they're showing, I just read recently, that there's increased level of colon cancer in people under 50. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest reasons is because they're not taking enough fiber. And we know in terms of Parkinson's that, one of the biggest benefits of having fiber is the production of short-chain fatty acids, which are produced by the microbes in your gut, which actually help to tighten the gut lining in your gut, which potentially is stopping the transfer of alpha-synuclein. So basically, misfolded alpha-synuclein, which travels up the vagus nerve and goes to the brain, the gut-brain sort of axis. And they've shown that in mouse models where they've cut the vagus nerve and, they've been able to see the alpha-synuclein, appear in the brain. So in terms of those short-chain fatty acids, they have a real benefit to the bowel. We need a lot more research around that as well. But fiber is one of the main sources to produce those short-chain fatty acids. Mm-hmm. So, and most people aren't taking enough. So it's between 25 and 30 grams of fibre a day. And again, it's about just educating people, taking out packets of foods and saying, showing them how to read the labels, how they can work out, what fibre is in their food so they can sort of see across a day how little fibre. And one thing I often say to people is if your meals are very white, you're not getting enough fibre. So if it's very white, very bland, you're not getting the colourful fruits and veg, you're getting processed, rice and pasta, you're not getting the fibre in. Mm-hmm. So
I want to anchor my next question on a very important point, so that potentially, you talk about bacteria and the gut-brain axis. Why is this so important? And to someone who is also new in PD, what do they need to know about the gut-brain axis?
I think they need to know that, the gut is known as the second brain. It's basically the second highest amount of nerves outside of the brain. And it also produces half of your dopamine and serotonin. Which are both
more than 90%. Yeah.
Happy hormones, and what's going to keep us going, moving, as well as, helping our motivation, our mood, etc. So the gut is actually a really important part of Parkinson's care. So you look after the gut, you're looking after your brain. It's not just, I think people think of, the brain as, brain health is just above the neck, it's just the brain, but actually they forget that the brain is part of a neurological system which impacts all the organs in the body. So if you're not, looking after the brain and you're not looking after the nerves and the bowel, the second center, brain center, well, you're kind of missing half of the picture.
I had a mentor in my university when I was still a young trainee in neuroscience. It was like, from here down, it matters.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's a bit like, bikini medicine. Women's health was always seen as just, below the belly button in terms of, just to do with the ovaries. But now we know that actually, Alzheimer's is actually a brain condition. It's not, an ovary condition in terms of, menopause, I should have said. It's not just about the ovaries. Actually, it starts in the brain. So, I think it's a fallacy just to focus on the brain alone. And I'm very sort of interested in that area because I have celiac disease as well. And it actually has a very similar kind of process in terms of, it's because you've got an immune response to a thing called gliadin, which is in your breads and pastas and your carbohydrate foods. And basically that gliadin it basically damages the gut lining and it makes it leaky. The gliadin protein gets out and travels around, the bloodstream and goes into different organs and causes things like eye problems. It causes alopecia. It causes, aches and pains in the joints. So things can leak out of the gut and cause systemic problems. And I do think there's probably, a lot of reason to think that that's the same thing that happens in Parkinson's. So I suppose going back to a person who's newly diagnosed, it should be about saying, first of all, checking if they've constipation. And probably 8 out of 10 times the person says, yes, I've had constipation for years. And explaining to them that, it's a prodromal symptom of Parkinson's. And it's to do with, the slow lack of dopamine in the gut, which slows down the gut, which obviously then leads to, worsening of the constipation. And just how it's important to get on top of that constipation, to help feed the bowel and make sure that it has more healthy bacteria in it that helps to produce those short-chain fatty acids, that it's, potentially very beneficial for progression, but most importantly for them, how they're feeling now, that, because most people go on levodopa, how to make sure that levodopa is not, affected by you being constipated. So the importance of keeping the bowel healthy is and constipation and the fibre is a really important part of that conversation with newly diagnosed person.
Constipation can really be one of the most troublesome symptoms. I know people who for over a week sometimes they cannot be regular. So what do you think about the role also here of hydration and potentially some support with maybe pre or probiotics?
Yeah, so in terms of the first protocol is if someone is impacted for several weeks, they probably need laxative to get in there and clear that out, because that can be very dangerous in terms of an impacted bowel. And there are a number of people with Parkinson's who have burst their bowel because they've been too reluctant to take laxatives. They think it's a failure. They feel like I should be able to manage this myself. But actually, what people have to realize is we have a lazy bowel because of the lack of dopamine. It slows down the gut. So not to take it as a failure that you can't, it's part of your Parkinson's. And actually there's research to show from King's College London that a trial that they did with people taking laxatives, it actually improved rigidity by 3% year on year by people taking their laxatives. And part of that is because it allows you for your medication to work more effectively. So that helps control your symptoms better. There's also a theory that perhaps it's actually impacting the microbiome, and that might be having an impact on, progression as well. So I think if someone's like, week to 2 weeks, I would be saying, look, you need to go back to your GP and you need to get on top of that first. And then, that would be in that kind of case if they're kind of impacted. Because if you throw loads of fibre on top of an impacted bowel, you could cause a lot more damage. So, and often people, they don't take much fibre and they suddenly load in a lot. The bowel can't handle it. So it needs to be done slowly over a period of time to bring up there. So if they've been on, 15 grams of fibre, you don't suddenly tell them to whack in 30 grams. That'll, cause a lot more problems. So I say that's in that case. So in general, I would sort of, again, through the food diary, identify, what foods, how much fibre they have, and then start to, educate them about taking in foods that are higher in fibre over a period of time, taking enough fluid, making sure they exercise, because the bowel, is
absolutely.
If you take out the bowel and put it around, I think it goes several times around a rugby pitch, it's very big, so it needs to be exercised. So those are the basic kind of healthy lifestyle approaches. If that's not working, then you might go to something like a probiotic. Now, there's not enough evidence to actually prescribe probiotics for people with Parkinson's for constipation, but there is research in some probiotics that show that it has benefit. So I'd often say to people, if you want to try that, trial it for 3 months. If it works, you can keep going. But I know people who've tried, particular ones and it hasn't worked for them. Mm-hmm. So I think, again, it's down to your individual sort of microbiome makeup. And then the other option is the laxatives. But I remember a neurologist saying to me, could you just get all my patients to take their laxatives? So I tell them, and like that's such a waste of neurologist time, precious time, is people pinging in and out because they're constipated and they're not taking their laxative. And I don't mean that but we need to, realize that these are actually beneficial to people with Parkinson's, not to fear them. And when they tell you to take it 3 times a day, take it 3 times a day and take it for the couple of months, because it takes time to actually for the bowel to regulate. And you can always look at, if you manage to get on top of it, you can reduce that down and have the diet take over. Sometimes people need a combination of both. It's again, it's an individual thing. And I suppose the other thing is enemas. Do not enemas, but irrigation, colonic irrigation. Do not do that. It can cause more damage than good. It can take out a lot of the beneficial bacteria. In some cases, people might need an enema because if they're blocked and they need to be cleared out, they'd be given that by their consultant or GP. So those are kind of, some of the things that I would say. And also, it's something that I've noticed a lot of people have a thing called dysenergic defecation. So that's where I'd have a lot of people saying, I'm doing all the right things, I'm eating all the right fibre, I'm drinking all the fluid, but I still can't go to the toilet. And I noticed a lot of women in particular saying that they were manually evacuating their bowels. And I was going, this is crazy. Like, this should not be happening to young women with Parkinson's. So I started to research into it and I realized that there was this thing called dysenergic defecation. So basically, in Parkinson's, because our muscles are affected by the lack of dopamine, our pelvic floor is also affected. So when you go to do a poo, basically your pelvic floor should drop. So your poo comes along, your colon gets to your anus, and when you basically push a poo out, your pelvic floor should drop. But with people with Parkinson's, it's tense, so it won't go down. So as a pelvic floor physio said, like the lift gets, but the door won't open. The lift is kind of down here and the door's up here, and they can't get it out. But there is, what is great is that pelvic floor physios can help you with that. And there's particular electrical therapy they can use, a bit like a TENS machine. They can actually stimulate the bowel to help you move past that bowel motion. Mainly, I'd say here in the States, I've seen there's very few physios, none in the UK who are familiar with it. But interesting enough, it's used for other neurodegenerative conditions like MS, and other conditions. So I think it's something that we need to push for more for people with Parkinson's, because it's absolutely ridiculous in this day and age that people are manually evacuating their bowels. Like, that shouldn't be happening.
Yeah. so important tips. I'm loving this conversation, so we will just keep going. But you mentioned on a critical point, and so for us, this podcast is just important to be also very realistic and get even sometimes the brutal truth.
Yes.
So the magic pill and the fact that many people said like are reluctant to take maybe the laxative and do a few things.
Yes.
Yet taking supplements,
Yeah.
sometimes even too many,
Yeah.
and not really knowing what to take, it's a big thing. So what is your take? How should we educate people on the correct supplements? Where is evidence? Where is not?
Yeah. Well, this question is well timed because I just co-authored a paper with a good friend of mine who's a fantastic researcher, Dr. Fiona Lithander, and her team in New Zealand, so neurologist and two of their postdocs. And I was involved as a co-author in terms of reviewing, they did the lines work of all the going through the papers, etc. And specifically looking at supplements in terms of progression. And, basically the answer is there is none at the moment. But what I would say is there's some signals and some good signals. But what it's also saying is that we need investment in the research to actually prove those signals can maybe give us, some answers with regard to progression. So one is omega-3 supplements. So in the paper that definitely showed potential, but they need longer trials. The other thing that potentially showed benefit was a niacin, a form of niacin called, I can never say it, nicotinamide. And that definitely, has, I think, some interesting, I think there's a trial going on at the moment. There's going to be a number of years before the answers come out. I think in terms of supplements, probiotics will come into that. And certainly there is interesting research around the probiotics potentially having effect, but it seems to be the multi-strain probiotics that are having the most effect. I think part of the problem is there's so much research doing so many different types of strains. We're not getting consistent. If you had, 5 centres looking at the same and they all came out with the same, you'd have like a bulk of evidence. You could say, okay, this is definitely showing. But it's one thing like rereading the paper before I came here is like there's such variety in how the trials are done, what endpoints they're looking at, what markers they're looking at. So it's very hard to get a kind of a consistent answer.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the problem in terms of progression, is that we need more money to do more research, and it needs to be more uniform. And I think that's where they need more nutrition researchers as part of these research trials that neurologists are doing, because the nutrition researchers bring that knowledge of how to run a proper trial within a nutrition setting, because that's their expertise, to kind of get the outcome or the answers, potentially. And then in terms of, it's then different in terms of your day-to-day symptom control and your day-to-day health. So definitely things like your vitamin B12 are very important. Vitamin B6, actually, in the States here, the FDA came out with a press release there recently saying that people who were taking more than 1,000 milligrams of levodopa a day and up to 1,500 milligrams have a high risk of epileptic fits. And there was actually, out of 14 cases, 2 deaths that arose from that. So now they're actually saying there should be a warning on the levodopa tablets around this. And the people, anyone who's on that close to 1,000 milligrams should be getting their B6 checked regularly. So I would always say to people, get their vitamin B12, their vitamin B6. Quite hard in Ireland, for example, or the UK to get B6 done through a normal practice. B12, I know for a lot of people I talk to in the UK, they rarely get it done because it's a bit more expensive. Vitamin D is really important for obvious reasons, which is to do with bone health. And obviously people with Parkinson's have a higher risk of falling. If their bones are weak, end up in hospital. That's a bad place to be. Because people with Parkinson's have the longest bed stays of all neurological conditions. And a big part of that is because they're not usually given their meds on time properly, and they're not usually looked after as well, because there's such a lack of understanding of Parkinson's in hospitals, although it's beginning to change. So vitamin D is really important. And I do think, again, in the paper, it didn't show vitamin D helped to slow progression, but I think there's lots of signals that there is something going on there in terms of metabolism of vitamin D, because a lot of people that I've spoken with Parkinson's often are low in vitamin D before they've even been diagnosed. Same with vitamin B12. So there's a derangement of nutrients that's happening before people are diagnosed. Whether that's a consequence of the Parkinson's or it's part of the why you develop Parkinson's, we don't know. And then the usual ones, in terms of your iron, 'cause there's definitely an issue in terms of a lot of people, including myself, have low ferritin, which is iron stores. So there's definitely something going on with our iron metabolism. So Parkinson's often has high iron in the brain, but yet they've low iron stores. So is that because it's depositing in the brain, and so we don't have enough in our storage? So there's a lot that we need. So that needs to be checked as well. The other thing would be things like blood sugar levels, or HbA1c, because people with type 2 diabetes have higher risk of developing Parkinson's. A lot of people with Parkinson's can develop diabetes. So having a check on their blood sugar control, of making sure that they don't get pre-diabetes, and then also the fat metabolism can be deranged in Parkinson's. So making sure that their cholesterol levels, because actually there's a heart-brain axis as well in Parkinson's. In terms of the autonomic system can be affected. That's why a lot of people with Parkinson's can have high blood pressure, low blood pressure, can have, dizzy spells, because the heart system is kind of, the heart and brain kind of work in tandem, a bit like the gut, So looking after those markers of your heart health is really important as well.
I'm glad you mentioned this about the glucose, because we actually have even some evidence in few cohorts of PD that people who have higher triglyceride and glycemic index, they had lower scores on the MoCA scales, so the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, and lower striatal dopamine, which potentially might lead to more severe cognitive impairments down the road. So it's really, really important.
But it's interesting when people have raised blood sugars, they usually have raised triglycerides or cholesterol alongside it, so that they kind of tend to go hand in hand. So that's why it's important to kind of get that whole, blood panel done. Your HDL, your LDL, and your triglycerides. And obviously as well with people with Parkinson's, they have a big sweet tooth, which again is a lot driven by the Parkinson's. The lack of dopamine kind of creates this sort of craving. And also the actual medication can cause a bit of, craving as well. And if you're eating a lot of high sugar foods, it is a direct cause of increasing your triglycerides. So, kind of all has a knock-on effect. Your behaviors and your Parkinson's all affect, your nutrition, and your nutrition affects your Parkinson's. Kind of a two-way street.
How do you navigate? So there's always this frustration that I personally also feel when, as soon as a person gets diagnosed, we put immediately the PD lenses on, let's say, and everything gets filtered just through Parkinson. Yes. And yes, we don't have yet evidences that all those specific supplements can really help in slowing down the progression. Yet when we look just as people, before the diagnosis, or just like at the physiology, what type of support could we add? Maybe also in terms of supplements, but purely from a, say, physiological level, performance, aging, more longevity, if you wish, that could help them build a bit of, let's say, resilience maybe, and then cope better for PD. That said, again, not to slow down PD, but just to make your organism, as it is now, more resilient.
Well, for me, to be honest, it comes down to the diet is the foundation. The supplements are kind of an add-on, but if you haven't got the basics right, the supplements are a waste of money. Might as well chuck them out. You're just putting money down the drain. Because ultimately, if you haven't got the scaffolding looked after, you're on shaky ground. And most people, again, going back to the food diary, when you start looking at it, you realise they're not eating enough fibre, they're not eating enough fruit and veg, they're not eating, maybe too much protein or too little protein. They're not getting enough carbohydrates. That's why they're fatigued. That's why they end up, snacking on sugary foods, because they ultimately don't have enough carbs in their day to keep them going. So it's actually, when you look at those basic, and it's not very sexy, but actually it's what works time and time again. And, in terms of all the research at the moment, it's the Mediterranean diet that's coming out as the front runner in terms of being the most benefit to people with Parkinson's. And that is because it's shown across many diseases. Like, they've tried trials of supplements over the years, and they've all many times failed in other conditions. And in some cases, in cancer, for example, certain high dose vitamins have actually worsened a cancer. So, supplements are not benign. If you take a nutrient and you make it very powerful, it can actually have a negative impact rather than the positive impact. But they began to realize it's the pattern of the foods working together. It's the nutrients and the phytochemicals within that pattern of foods working in your body that has the power. So, that's why, kind of say that, taking your fruit and veg is like nature's multivitamin. It actually packs a huge punch, more so than probably taking a pill out of it. So what's the point if someone's eating takeaways 5 times a week, drinking cans of Coke all day, 10 biscuits a day, and then they're taking the multivitamin? Like, it's just nonsense. It doesn't make sense. So I think, and when people start actually improving the foundations, they start to feel better. Mm-hmm. And when you start to feel more energy, then that helps you take up others. You start walking. You start, one begets the other.
Mm-hmm. So, sleep gets better also.
And your sleep gets better. Absolutely. 100%. And I think with a lot of people with Parkinson's complain about sleep. But a big part of that is their eating habits. And we know, again, taking a leaf from a friend of mine, she's the head of nutrition for Irish Sport. She does amazing, if you want to follow her, Sharon Madigan is her name. Mm-hmm. And I know her for years in terms of doing sports nutrition with her years ago. But like she's done amazing stuff with nutrition for the Irish athletes. But she posts on LinkedIn great sort of with AI now you can do these brilliant graphics of that. But they did a study looking at sleep in athletes because obviously it's a big problem for athletes as well. And they looked at specific foods, so things like cherries and kiwis. 2 kiwis a day improve their sleep, and it's the same. The kiwis we know helps the bowel. So again. Could be 2 things going on. It could be gut, impacting in terms of, the sleep as well as obviously, other factors going on. So, again, comes down to the food was actually what helped their sleep. Mm-hmm. So going back to the basics, Sonia Sullivan was a fantastic runner, Irish runner. And I remember reading an article about, how she helps herself wind down at night and to sleep better. She ate a banana. And what's in bananas? Tryptophan. And tryptophan is something that helps you sleep. So it's a bit like, when you have a big turkey dinner, why people fall asleep afterwards, because they've had a whack of tryptophan in the turkey dinner. So again, food is medicine. Like it's very, very powerful. And it won't kill you or won't cause trouble, because you can overeat and it can cause trouble if you overeat on the wrong foods. Things like ultra-processed foods we know can have big impacts. Not just on Parkinson's, but the brain health in general. And it's a real concern in terms of younger people. Yeah. Mental health. If you talk about brain health, I don't think you can talk about mental health without talking about brain health. But anyway, that's another hobby horse.
No, absolutely. It's relevant. And tell me though, what are these basics? So for our listeners, they might now be wondering, okay, what does it mean going back to the fundamentals? Like how should I be eating? So could you give us some just examples of how could the best breakfast or the best lunch and dinner look like? I know it's very, of course, personalized, but just a sort of basic idea so that people get some grasp.
Well, I suppose, and a lot of people diss them, but there are food guidelines that are in every country. And these, a lot of people diss them, but actually they're based on a lot of fundamentally very good science research. And they're actually, developed to meet everybody's needs. Because it's not just people who can afford food. It's people who are on a low wage need to be able to eat properly as well. So it might be a food plate, it might be a food pyramid. But if you follow those, and literally if you go to the food pyramid and you actually look and see, do I eat everything from every food group? That's the first thing. Am I getting my whole grains in? Am I getting my carbohydrates in? Am I getting my fruit and veg in? Am I getting my calcium-rich foods, my dairy foods, or non-dairy replacements if you want? Am I getting my protein? Am I getting my fats? So they're very good basic building sort of plates to start from. And in terms of, I would always say to people as well, to think of a thing like the 3 amigos. So ensuring you're getting your carbs, your protein, and your fruit and veg in on each meal. And if you think of it that way, so you can make your breakfast and you can say, okay, I'm going to have, porridge oats is a big thing in Ireland, for example. It's a very good, nutritious food, soluble fibre in it, very good for the bowel, very good for moving poo through the bowel in terms of constipation, very good for absorbing cholesterol out of the bowel. Very many reasons why you'd have oats. So you have oats in Ireland, people would cook them like hot porridge. So you have your fibre in that, and then you'd make sure that you maybe put berries on it, and then you might, in terms of your, your carbs, your protein would be, say, your dairy, or it might be oat milk or something that you put on instead. So very basic. I don't think it has to be something that is a big palaver, especially when you have Parkinson's. It needs to be simple that you can eat it and that you like it. And then it might be lunch. You might decide to have, a salad. So you're getting your fruit and veg. You can put your strawberries in a salad as well. You'd put your protein in. So it might be fish, it might be chicken, it might be egg, it might be, plant-based protein. And then you might have some carbohydrates. So you might put, like here, you might have your whole grain bread that you might have with it, or you might, put in some quinoa or, some grain in with it and get your carbohydrates. There you've got your 3 omegas in that meal. And then your evening meal, similarly, you might have, your salmon, it's your protein. You might boil yourself some potatoes and you might have frozen veg. Again, it doesn't have to be, because not everyone can afford to buy organic, and also if someone with Parkinson's, they might be too tired to shop. So get some frozen veg. It's as good as, and sometimes better than fresh veg. So it's about keeping it simple, especially with Parkinson's, because you've got that cognitive executive functioning issues in terms of trying to plan things, multitask, so you need things that you can put together quite simply. Mm-hmm. If you want to do some kind of highfalutin cookbook, do it, but do it when you're well on your meds and you've plenty of time to do it and you can afford it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Dairy and Parkinson. It's still a complex topic, but is it really something in the dairy, or is more all the chain behind? So how, say, pesticides or other chemicals were sprayed on the food and the food that the animal ate, and then, of course, let's say the milk and so all the products that we created.
So dairy has got, such a hard time in the whole Parkinson's world. And I think, somewhere along the way, dairy was the evil one. Yeah. But the research does not bear out that dairy causes Parkinson's. Now, there is definitely a link. There's an association between dairy intake and the risk of Parkinson's, but there's been a big study, systematic review that came out, 2 of them actually quite recently, that showed that actually there wasn't a link. It wasn't associated as robustly as, some of the individual studies showed. But there were 2 things that were quite interesting. One was it seemed to be milk was the main offender. And that would make sense because things like cheese and yogurts actually have bacteria in them to make them, where milk doesn't. And then the other thing would be, what's quite interesting was it showed signals that it might actually have more of a risk in men than women. And that I think is very interesting because it's possibly to do with the uric acid, because we know the uric acid is protective, but obviously dairy helps to reduce uric acid. So I think dairy is kind of a proxy for something that's going on. I don't think dairy is per se the problem. There's something that dairy is linking with, and we don't know quite what it is. So is it that it's pesticides? Because in the dairy milk, it's absorbed more, into the dairy milk, and maybe through the other processing of the yogurts, and because the bacteria somehow doesn't get affected as much. And then also in terms of, there has been one paper, but there needs to be more research on a sugar called galactose that has been potentially seen as a conduit in that sort of dairy Parkinson's, but there's only one paper on it. Like we need more research. And I think what's really unfair about the bashing of dairy is that actually could have negative impacts on people's health, because dairy has a really important role in bone health. Also, it actually is very beneficial to cognitive health. So it's shown that 2 servings of dairy a day actually benefits cognitive health. Dairy is very good for blood pressure control. So, and if you look at, say, the Nordic countries, they eat a lot of dairy, and actually they have some of the lowest levels of Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative conditions, and they eat more dairy than other countries. So, yeah, there's so much that we don't know about dairy, and I think we're throwing what we say is the baby out with the bathwater by telling people, that there's a risk of developing or progressing Parkinson's with dairy when we don't have the research. Mm-hmm. I mean, if neurologists or researchers said the same thing about a drug without having more robust evidence, you'd be shot. Yeah. So I think we have to be careful about cutting out huge food groups. Yeah. There's definitely something there, but we don't know what the mechanism is, and there's definitely more benefit to having dairy in your diet than taking it out, would be what I would say at the moment on balance.
Yeah. I would like to pass to the second part of this conversation, which will be women with Parkinson. But before that, just any other thing you think it's important for our listeners about nutrition?
I think one of the things I really see in the Parkinson's community is the top shelf foods, the ultra processed foods. There's a lot of debate around ultra processed foods. It's been they call it I can't remember the name of the system they use to quantify what's an ultra processed food. there's a I can't, it's gone out of my head. But anyway, there's a lot of debate about, that people are kind of getting fixated and they're actually cutting out foods that are actually perfectly fine. So, people think that an ultra-processed food is anything that's packaged, but like there's lots of foods that are healthy or packaged. It comes down to choosing the ones that, if you read the labels and you check, I always say, whatever's in the pack should resemble what you would use in your ingredients to cook it. That's a pretty good. But if it's got like a list of ingredients that
you have no idea how to read,
and you don't know what the hell they are, well, then you probably need to put it back. So, it's a common sense approach. But there are what I call ultra-processed foods are kind of the top shelf foods in terms of discretionary foods, the cakes, the biscuits, the ice creams, the pies, or the deep fried foods, the takeaways. They're all the ultra-processed foods are processed in a lot of high fat, trans fats, not good for the heart, and also foods that have a lot of additives in them. Mm-hmm. Now, again, we need more research because some of those additives are really important to keep food and keep people protected from bacterial overgrowth in a food. So, again, we can't be throwing the baby without the bathwater. We need to know more about these, additives. There's certain emulsifiers that have definitely interesting research to show that they may be more problematic, so we need more research. But I think aside from that, if people just ate less crap, as in, all the chocolate cakes, biscuits, whatever, they would actually see a huge improvement in their Parkinson symptoms. But, so I think rather than focusing on, I follow the ketogenic diet, we need to just get the foundations right first. Yeah.
Very, very informational. So I hope that people will take notes out of all this conversation.
Just one other thing, actually, what I want to say, is malnutrition. That is a big problem in people with Parkinson's. So there are a lot of people who are underweight, a BMI less than 18, and people losing weight, and they're not getting access to a dietitian, or they're not getting access to a neurologist or Parkinson's nurse, and they're losing weight, and they're getting worse in their Parkinson's symptoms. So there are certain instances where people need to take more calories. But I know a lot of people who think that they can do it just by eating food. But if you're at a BMI of like 16 and you need to gain weight to get you up to a BMI nearer to 18 again, you're never going to do that with food alone. You're going to need nutritional supplement drinks to actually bring that weight up. People, for some reason, think that these are not good things to take. They're really important. So there are certain supplements that you can take 3 shots of collagen in a particular supplement, which is protein-free, and it gives you 450 calories in a 30 ml 3 times a day. It's a very easy way, because when you've lost a lot of weight, your stomach tends to shrink, your appetite is affected. Mm-hmm. You cannot eat the same quantity of food. So you need to build up that appetite, you need to build up your weight. And so I think it's just very important that sometimes we always talk about, people cutting out foods. But there are certain people that need to put in foods, put in more calories, and need nutritional supplement drinks to help them regain the weight. So you can go online and get yourself, look for BMI calculators. Mm-hmm. There's also a malnutrition nutrition score tool that you can get on a website called BAPN, which is a kind of an organization that sort of helps prevent or manage malnutrition. So that's just something else I want to get in there, because it is a continuing problem. And also people have a thing called sarcopenia, where they've losing their muscle mass and things like that. So it's not just about the people who are on the other end of the scale. It's also the people who are underweight that need the help.
Yeah. For sarcopenia, just to make sure that people are on our same page, it's not something that happened just because of nutritional patterns. It's something that happens with age. Around 30, 35 years of age, everyone starts losing muscle mass, but it's so critical, even more if you have PD. So. Yeah.
But generally speaking, most people, young people, won't get sarcopenia if they're, keep on top of their muscle. It tends to be kind of in older people, and it tends to be in people who have a inflammatory process going on as well. And in Parkinson's, there's definitely an inflammatory process going on. And also then, obviously, nutrition is a big part of that triad of, obviously exercise is really important, and particular supplementation and certain medications that help to kind of get on top of it. But I often think certain people with Parkinson have a kind of what we call cachexic, bit like a cancer look to them, quite sort of drawn in their face, quite sort of thin, muscular, and we know again that the fats are kind of deranged in Parkinson's as well. So it's trying to kind of identify that early to stop that derangement from happening is really important. So And I think that's part of the problem is a lot of, neurologists don't weigh patients, don't ask them some simple questions about their diet that would be red flags that they could then, refer to a dietitian or make sure they're, getting access to care early, because if they've lost weight, it's harder to come back from that, so.
Anchoring on this last point of neurologists sometimes not asking few questions, you as a woman, what question you have not been asked, let's say, in the clinical settings, maybe enough, maybe at all, and it would make a difference for a woman?
Well, I think a big thing in terms of Parkinson's for women is, from the nutrition side, is weight loss. Have they lost any weight, and are they suffering from dyskinesia? Because they're two alarm bells for me. And often, there's still this, some neurologists don't really look out for that in terms of, they know women have more dyskinesia, but they're not actually managing it. They're leaving women, on, or they're upping their doses of levodopa, which is only worsening their dyskinesia. They're losing more weight. Once you lose weight, you absorb more levodopa. It just becomes this vicious circle. So I think they need to break that circle by really drilling into that and finding out why have you lost weight and identifying, because a lot of people don't actually know whether they've dyskinesia or tremor. They mix it up, so people don't actually understand often what they're saying, or they explain it to the neurologist, and the neurologist thinks that, it's a tremor, but no, it's actually dyskinesia that they're. So there's a lot of problems around people actually understanding the different symptoms: dystonia, dyskinesia, tremor. They kind of can all be sort of mixed up together. So I think a bit of time for women is to actually, you'll probably find it maybe is dyskinesia that's underlying it. And then talking to them about their diet and talking about their, weight and stuff might start to get an underlying understanding of what's going on. And then if they, change the medication, they could really improve a woman's life. Maybe reduce their levodopa, maybe put them on an agonist instead. There might be other options. Now, I'm not a neurologist, but there's things that they're expert in that could help reduce that dyskinesia for women.
Yeah. On the same line of more education for women, could you walk us through the fact that many women, when they have, let's say, the menstruation, so the cycle, just prior to that, due to the estrogen drop, they might have higher menstrual fluctuation and also other symptoms. And I really experienced so many times that women are not aware of this, so they are scared or immediately think, oh my God, my Parkinson is progressing faster. But this is crucial also when women go through perimenopause, because estrogen also neuroprotective. So what is the information that we are missing and that we're not, say, giving to women?
So I could do a whole podcast on this alone. So this is was my first area of sort of passion when I was diagnosed first, because I was actually 3 months pregnant when I picked up my Parkinson's first. And then when my daughter was born, I had to wait until she was born and finish breastfeeding before I had a DAT scan to confirm I had Parkinson's. And then when I went back menstruating, I noticed that my Parkinson's symptoms got worse the week before my menstrual bleed. And it was actually when I was at the World Parkinson's Congress in 2019. Okay. I met two friends, Sri Sripathy and Kat Hill. And it was actually Sri and myself, we were talking a lot. And the way women sometimes, they can, when they live together, they can sync their cycles. And it was a bit like, it was almost like by, osmosis that we were basically, our cycles were in tune, but she was noticing the same thing. And we noticed other women within the young onset were mentioning the same, that they noticed their symptoms are worse. So I decided to put together a survey of women, and we put it out through the PD Avengers. And that actually was also through the Women's Parkinson's Project with myself and Kat and Sri set up, because we felt that women weren't really getting the answers and weren't been focused on in terms of their needs. So we did the survey of 240 women globally. And the survey showed that 84% said they had the same problem the week before, and about 50% the week during their menstrual cycle. And then that was repeated by the Michael J. Fox Foundation in their Inside platform. So Kat Hill, Sonia Mather, Christy LaMonica, a few of us, helped in terms of getting those surveys together, and they're doing a brilliant job with doing follow-up surveys around women's health. But those surveys showed the same thing as my basic Survey Monkey one. They obviously did a bigger one and showed the same thing, that women were reporting this worsening of the symptoms around the menstrual cycle. But they also showed that about 40%, and there was also a research group in the Val Hebron in Spain, repeated it and showed the same thing. So that was really great, because it was basically validating what we did in our basic survey. But they show that 40% of women were reporting that their medication did not work as well during that time. So like that's a big impact on a woman in terms of like it's bad enough having Parkinson's without, 2 weeks out of every month potentially. They're even worse, and there were women who were on the floor. And when we shared that information, we did a webinar and we had 600 women turn up over 2 webinars, one with Indu Subramanian with the PMD Alliance and also one with the Cure Parkinson Trust. And there's a lot of issues women are reporting, not just around the menstrual cycle, but around perimenopause and menopause. So in our survey, we also show that 40% of women going through the perimenopause notice that their symptoms fluctuate because obviously as you go through the perimenopause, your hormones are all over the shop. So that accounted for that sort of fluctuation. And again, the research that Insight have done, Fox Insight have corroborated that women notice. And also in Bas Bloom's team, I can't remember, the PhD of Wilma did the work on it, also showed that it was worse around the perimenopause. So there's been a lot more since that happened. We wrote a paper on the unmet needs of women with Parkinson's, and that seemed to kind of be a bit of a watershed. And really, Indu was very instrumental in driving that for us and helping us as a neurologist and MDS to really help, amplify our voices. And since then, like Eva, I just noticed in the World Parkinson's Congress research, posters, there's so much more around women and sex and gender than there was back in 2019. There's been a huge increase. And I think people are beginning to realise that hormones actually have a big impact on women. But also, interesting enough, there's some research to show that I know it's stupid, but I didn't realise that men actually have estrogen as well. I stupidly didn't know that. And also have FSH and LH, which obviously women have a lot more of. Yeah. But there's research to show that men who have more residual estrogen have a less aggressive Parkinson's. And women who have more residual estrogen after the menopause have a less aggressive Parkinson's as well. So there's something neuroprotective potentially, not just for women, but maybe for men as well. So there's a lot of answers in our bodies, I think, for all of us, not just for women, that we need more answers from. Yeah.
And is there any latest evidence or research on potential hormonal replacement therapy?
There's a lot of research in Alzheimer's, and thankfully Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are beginning to sort of, compare notes a bit more. But there's a fantastic research called Lisa Mosconi. I don't know if you're familiar with her. Yep. She's made Italian. Yep. She's an amazing woman. I'd be a fangirl. But actually there's also an amazing researcher called Roberta Brinton, who's actually here at the WPC. She actually, I think her research center is here in Phoenix or in Arizona. And she's done a lot of work with Lisa around the whole menopause side and the impact on Alzheimer's. So she was the one who identified that sort of critical window of 10 years, that if women take HRT in that 10 years critical window of when you start the perimenopause, it reduces your risk of developing Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. What we don't know is whether HRT helps to slow progression of Parkinson's. But I think the point is that HRT has a lot of benefit to health. Back to your point, it's not just about Parkinson's, it's about your whole life. And a woman goes through a major event called the menopause, which has a big impact on your bone health, your heart health,
brain health,
so
everything.
We need to be treating that anyway, regardless of the Parkinson's, because if you're, not having hot sweats, it's going to make your Parkinson's better because you're going to sleep better, So there's a bit of pragmatism. Yeah. But back to your question around any research on HRT to show slow progression, not at the moment in Parkinson's. However, we developed an app called My Moves Matter, which we developed as arose out of the paper, the unmet needs paper, because we identified an action plan in that. And one of the things we said is we need something for women to be able to track their symptoms across their menstrual cycle so they can prove to the neurologists. Because the neurologists in the survey we did, 90% of the women said that the neurologists didn't ask them. And were dismissive of them. So we wanted to give them a tool so they could actually, track it and go, there's the evidence. And then we decided to do a prospective study using the app to track, women with Parkinson's, track their Parkinson's symptoms across their hormonal status. So whether they'd menstrual cycle or whether they're perimenopause or postmenopause. So we have papers here, posters that we're presenting. And one of the interesting things out of one of the posters showed that women of a perimenopause age who took HRT had less tremor than women who didn't take it. Now, it was in a smallish number of women, but it's the first that I know of that actually shows. Now, it's obviously self-reported, but I think it's enough of a signal to say, maybe we need to be really looking at this and extending out and doing a proper trial in terms of looking at women who are on HRT, or, looking at and actually doing more research. And when I delved into what might be behind that, tremor has a different mechanism of working in the brain than, say, rigidity has. So, and it also was very interesting. It showed that women who were younger onset versus later onset, premenopausal, had a much higher level of dyskinesia than postmenopausal. So this is the first time this information has kind of come out, which I think is fantastic. But we need a lot more of it to actually, there's a lot of things can be help women now today. We have HRT. We have, we can deal with dyskinesia by treating women differently around the dosage, the timing of the dosage, swapping in different medications. Like women are given often with dyskinesia are given CONT enzyme inhibitors. But what they do is they reduce your CONT enzyme, which basically, if you have too much of it, it blocks your levodopa getting into your brain. But in women, we have a low level of it. So if you take CONT enzyme, it actually lowers it more. So women get more and it worsens their dyskinesia. But the drug was only developed in one size for men. So you can't have it because it's a capsule. And they're not going to do that research again just for women at the moment. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place just because of our physiology. So yeah, there's a lot more that needs to be done. I'm quite passionate about it.
Yeah, I love this topic as well. And as I'm researching, I'm deepening even more. But very practically, and to help women listening to us, what questions should they be asking? And is it to the neurologist? Is it to the gynecologist? Is it to the endocrinologist? Is it to all three of them?
Yeah, all of the above. Well, particularly in terms of hormones, generally probably the gynecologist and the neurologist. They need to say to the neurologist. And what I did at the beginning, so many women reached out to us and said, oh my God, I thought I was going out of my head. I was been dismissed so much. I was told it was anxiety. The amount of women with Parkinson's are put on anxiety medication when it's actually their menopause that's the problem. And, for some women, HRT is going to help with that. I'm not saying everyone needs HRT. There are other things like cognitive sleep therapy is very beneficial in women with menopause as well. There's other alternative things that you can look to get treated with. But I think neurologists have to see the person. And they keep on telling us that you see one person with Parkinson's, you see one person with Parkinson's. But are they really seeing that one person with Parkinson's when they're treating them exactly like a man? Like, we're not small men. We have different, and we can see that not just in Parkinson's, but across many other, areas. We know that heart attacks now present completely differently in women than they do to men. More women die of heart attacks because basically they're not picked up as they are in men.
I'm so grateful you said it like this. And I hope that also clinicians will listen to this episode to really understand, to treat women differently, to ask few questions, to listen, and for all women to really be brave.
Yeah, and I often say to women, bring in the paper, the unmet needs paper, and give it to them. Bring in the papers. They can't refute. And that's why I did the research with My Moves Matter, was because they kept on saying there's no evidence for that. So now we have got evidence for it. So they need to start, taking that on board. And I think as well, most of the neurologists, whether male or female, have sisters, have mothers, have daughters, and they know themselves that they're completely different to men, so why does healthcare treat us all the same? Like, it just blows my mind. Yeah. No pun intended.
Where do you think it's the gap? On one side, of course, we need to follow science, be on the data, but at the same time, sometimes we need to be able also to think outside of the box, because if we think what might be happening and pose a good question, we could make, of course, a step forward. So why some neurologists might be so reluctant to listen to women and just dismiss so easily?
I think, to be fair to them, they've never been trained in female, biology. It's not something that's part of their curriculum. I think that's fundamentally, it's a bit like nutrition. It's not part of their curriculum. So they're not going to do something that they haven't really been exposed to, So I think it's really important that they're trained in nutrition, the basics enough to feel they can ask the right questions and then refer on appropriately. Or in some cases deal with it, because it's basic level stuff that they could deal with. When people are more complex, then they refer on to a dietitian. in terms of, there's lots of people like the work that you're doing that can help with people, educating in terms of other health professionals that can actually ask the questions around diet that will actually, catch those early things. And so it doesn't get to the more complex, but the more complex patients can be referred on to people like dietitians. But also in terms of the hormone side of things is to, to have an interest and kind of just sit back and go, like, it makes sense. Like, neurologists are such intelligent, like probably one of the most highly intelligent consultants that I know, almost too intelligent, and can be a bit dismissive of, but actually when you look underneath the bonnet of what seems kind of basic is actually the neurology, the neuroscience is fascinating behind hormones and the impact on the brain. So I think just to see the different person in front of the diverse person, and not just, sex, but also the gender aspects of how women approach decision-making differently to men. So we know with DBS, for example, that there's a bias where women don't get referred to DBS as much. And when they do get referred, they often don't take it on as much as men do. And that's probably because there's a lot more fear around having deep brain surgery, having a family or things like that. But, understanding women take longer to make those decisions. They need more information. Like in my case, I'd be potentially a candidate for DBS. But one of the reasons I'm a bit reluctant at the moment is because there's not much information around women and their outcomes. So I'm going, do I want to have brain surgery? And I don't know whether this is going to benefit me or not as a woman. I'm a bit I think I need more information.
I would like for our listener to take a big take-home message of also what you just said. And for me, it's always to help them navigate the complex landscape of PD, to know, yes, neurologists are critical, but there are many things that they have not been trained into, for nutrition, for exercise, for female physiology. So for everybody to really learn how to create, your own care team.
Yeah.
How have you done this for yourself, and how would you otherwise suggest somebody else to, put this team, and who are the key players?
Yeah, I mean, like it flabbergasts me that, if you're diagnosed with diabetes, you're immediately referred into what we call a diabetes daycare centre, and you're seen by a nurse, diabetes nurse. You're seen by the dietitian who goes through carb counting with you, or if you're insulin counting or whatever. If you're, if you've got PCOS alongside that, they have a physio maybe help you in terms of the exercise stuff. You see an endocrinologist. There's a whole team around you. If you're diagnosed with cancer, you get a whole oncology team around you. If you're diagnosed with cardiac, problems, you are put into a cardiac program. Get diagnosed with Parkinson's, you're given a pill and you're told you've got 10 good years. There you go. That's it. Like, it's absolutely crazy for something that has more than 45 symptoms, progressive, neurodegenerative, has no cure. And that's the story you're told. Like, it's criminal, absolutely criminal, the lack of resources for Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative conditions. I mean, in Europe alone, neurological conditions cost more than cancer, diabetes, and heart disease combined.
Combined altogether, yeah.
Basically 1 in 3 people have a neurological condition. That's like 3.6 billion people, more than a third of the total population in the world. Like, it's like, and the problem is, I think they're almost like rabbits in a headlight. They don't know how to deal with the tsunami that's already arrived. But I think, back to your point, is you're never going to be able to see a physio, an OT, an SLT. They're the people you need to have in your corner. Not all at the same time. You may not need all of them. You may not have swallow problems, but as you get older, you might need, most people I know older and even younger have swallow issues, but maybe they're not getting in the way until maybe they're older. But you need a speech therapist. You're going to need an occupational therapist in terms of helping with things like, adaptive cutlery or adapting your house, or, helping. OTs can really help you in terms of managing your routine, helping you to sort of plan out your day, how to manage fatigue. They do a lot of that, particularly over here in the States. They're brilliant at that. You have your physios, obviously, particularly your neurophysios, who really, going to get into as you do, in terms of, the more specific exercise, in terms of your resistance, and also tailoring it to what age you are and your capability, etc. Yeah. So you need your physio, you need a dentist. Access, good dental care is really important for Parkinson's, because we know now that there's dysbiosis or, bacteria in the mouth.
Mouth.
And and we know there's research. Movers and Shakers is a great podcast in the UK. Did a recent interview with some dentists, researchers, and showing now that, if you have this sort of bacteria, so if you've got gingivitis, infection in your mouth, in your teeth, it can actually worsen your Parkinson's symptoms. So it's like having a viral infection. Most people, when they got an infection with Parkinson's, tend to have their symptoms worsen over a period of time. So keeping on top of your dental health is really important. People often have bruxism where they have sort of tight jaws and they're breaking their teeth. So they need to get care to help with these things. Obviously, things like a psychologist is really important. Mental health is a really big issue, and obviously a dietitian. I've been campaigning should be part of that, very much core part of the team. We all know exercise is really important, but nutrition is without doubt one of the biggest cornerstones of care for Parkinson's that has been left out of the picture. And I will keep banging on until it becomes, and it is becoming, that people are mentioning it more and more as part of their treatment. So you kind of have to get your own little toolkit together, and you have to shout loud within health systems to get what you want. Obviously, those who can afford can find people, privately. What I would say to people who can't afford is they need to keep harassing their neurologist in the hospital setting or in the community setting and ask, I need to see a dietitian. If you're having swallowing issues, like the amount of people I speak to have swallowing issues and they've never been referred to a speech therapist, like you've got to get your GP and you've got to tell them that you're choking. That's actually a red flag. That is a risk factor that GP is bound to make sure that he, gets you the proper treatment to avoid you choking and dying effectively. Same with malnutrition. It's very important. Like doctors cannot let someone just continue to lose weight. That's negligent. So you need to, even if you can't afford to do it privately, shout, get access. The more you talk about it, the more you raise it, the more you bang on about it, the more likely you're going to get the service. Unfortunately, that's the way the system works. Yeah. Certainly my familiarity with the UK and Ireland is those who shout loudest get the services.
Yeah. Richelle, I have a little bit of a, personal question, which is, how can I, through even, let's say, a podcast as this one, raise my voice to help women? What do you think it's something I could really do to move forward this topic?
Well, interviewing me today.
More than welcome.
Give me a platform to share the research. I think, it's probably really important that, it's a bit like a very basic thing, but actually it's been really important. The Parkinson's UK have been a great supporter of all our work around women with Parkinson's, the research we've done, and they've produced a little sort of leaflet for women with Parkinson's. And I think that's actually really powerful, that you're not, you're giving it straight away that you are different and the way you're going to manage your Parkinson's is going to be different. And if you've any of these issues, not to hide it away, to actually talk about it, So I think that's a really important thing, is to almost have, like, within your practice, almost like a list of things for women that you could give them and say, these are things that, may affect you. Maybe reflect on it and come back to me, or, to help women to talk about it more, to have that, permission to talk about things that can be embarrassing, or maybe, they feel it isn't something to do with their Parkinson's. So, for example, one thing would be urinary issues are a big problem in Parkinson's. And I've gone through that myself. And, we don't talk about it enough in general outside of Parkinson's, but it affects so many women. And if you are peeing in your pants all the time, you're not going to go and exercise. Do I wear pads all the time because I play hockey, I still play Masters international hockey. And I'll wear pads and I'll wear, pull-up pants. But, like, not many women would do that. I don't care, because I want to be able to play the sport. Yeah. And women who aren't used to will stay at home and they won't go out. And they've been left like that, So we need, and there are things that can be done to help women in that situation, So, and also women in terms of we know, again, the research we've done corroborates with the research that shows that women suffer from more non-motor symptoms, mental health non-motor symptoms, anxiety, depression, and they're more serotonergic symptoms. And I think we need more research around not just the dopaminergic, but the serotonergic system, in terms of why are women suffering more from these symptoms. Obviously, hormones is part of that. There's some neurological other basis behind it. So I suppose with your neuroscience background, you trained under Bas Blum, is is maybe delving into that more, like what is really going on underneath here, asking questions, maybe doing part of your podcast is actually doing it on women in Parkinson's and having, neuroscientists on and asking the questions, getting into the science underneath it. And that's what you trained in. Yeah. That would be really interesting to I think it's a fascinating area. And I think there's more answers that we can get. So the more people who talk about it, ask questions, I think we're going to have an answer to help people with Parkinson's out of it,
What are 3 things that you would like to change in Parkinson care or research?
Obviously, slow progression, get a cure. Well, I suppose from a personal point of view, I would like I suppose on a very basic level, I would like every patient or person with Parkinson's to be weighed. That's a simple, actionable thing, to weigh someone, and you'll catch someone in terms of whether they're too much weight, and that's having an impact. So we know people who have deep brain stimulation, certain people gain up to 12 kilograms 1 year after DBS, and that can actually have more damaging ramifications because they can't exercise then. Or they're, impulse controlled eating or something. So, you can catch a lot by someone's weight, or if they're underweight, they're malnourished, you could catch them before it gets too bad. So I think that's a very powerful, just one thing that, everyone could do who works with people with Parkinson's. It could be a nurse, it could be you, it could be physio. Everyone should be asking that, checking that out. In terms of a second thing would be, I really want them to look at dyskinesia in women and actually start. We have answers today. We don't actually need more research. We actually have answers. We know the women metabolize the drugs differently. We know that that their hormones are, part of they can do stuff today to actually help manage that dyskinesia. And they talk about dyskinesia not being bothersome. It is really bothersome in young onset women who are trying to work, manage. I don't know if you've seen some of the women on Instagram. I'd like to show some of the neurologists those videos and say, now you try and live your day having dyskinesia, both, on and off dyskinesia. I mean, it's hard enough fluctuation without having on and off dyskinesia as well. So that's my second thing. And then the third one would be probably around the gut. I would really love gastroenterologists to be more involved in our care and to be more part of research. I'm delighted there's a woman who's just come out. She's a neurogastroenterologist called, I think it's Sharitza. Actually, she'd be someone who'd be really interesting for you to interview. She's based in, I'll find the podcast, but she was on the Michael J. Fox just recently on a webinar around gut health. She's doing specific research into Parkinson's in the gut. There's a gentleman, male neurogastroenterologist as well, who's done a podcast with Michael J. Fox. They are a huge part of the picture of caring for people, because with the gut, like from mouth to anus, there are so many things that interfere with Parkinson's along that journey that we are not intervening with right now that can make a lot of people's lives much better. Whatever about the research for future things like probiotics and fetal transplants. There's a lot of things that can be done now to help people in terms of reflux, slow gastric emptying, dyspneic gasification, H. pylori, SIBO. There are so many things that impact people that are not been dealt with, because neurologists aren't gastroenterologists. They're not specialists in the bowel. So they need to bring in the specialists in the bowel and help people with Parkinson's. So there are my 3 things.
What is your mission?
So for me, I suppose, personally, to live as long and as well as I can with Parkinson's. And part of, that is I've always had a thing about, what's the word, feeling a certain sense of unjust, or, rallying against what isn't just. And I think at the moment, Parkinson's is not getting a fair share of its care. And we could be doing much better as a community if we weren't, just given a pill and told you 10 years, good years, because it's very disabling, that message. So I want it to be a more enabling message. I want them to be told, yeah, here's your medication. This is going to really help your symptoms. But alongside that, it's really important that you exercise, because we know it really, and gives them a prescription for their exercise. And so from a dietitian or nutrition point of view, that's why I developed Nutrition PD, was to give access. So that basically my sort of vision is that someone is given a prescription for a program around nutrition that is prescribable, that will give them a lot of the answers they can't get from seeing the neurologist once every 10 minutes, once a year, or every 2 years for some people, or none, as in some countries. So, yeah, that's kind of, what I'd like is that there's a much more, I suppose, holistic and a much more empowering way of helping people to live better with Parkinson's than currently is the case. And I think that's why the WPC is so powerful, because it brings all of those passions together, in terms of people really want to make a difference,
Richelle, I have the feeling I could continue talking with you like for hours, literally, but we came to a conclusion, and I would like to ask you for a small help.
Mm-hmm.
And it's continue the conversation, continue the momentum also with my next guest. So anything you would like to ask can be in more fundamental research, can be women. I can tell you just one thing, that one of my next guests is a big researcher, a big voice also for women in PD.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it can be literally whatever you feel it's an important research that we are not asking enough, and then you would like to have, so to move the needle.
I would like research into hormone replacement therapy in women with Parkinson's to see whether it actually has an impact on slowing progression or improving symptom control, whichever. Yeah.
I'm with you on this. I will then just finish with the last question, and this comes from my previous guest. And the previous guest is a young lady researching more fundamental aspect of PD, alpha-synuclein, proteins, lysosomes, yet she's one of those people very much aware of how she approached the person, who do she have in front. And so she knew that you are also a researcher in PD, but also a person who has it. And she really wanted to ask you, what do you think we are missing, given you have both these perspectives, and how would you like to give an extra, say, or make an extra change in the research part?
I think there's a number of answers I could give to that. I think we need to be more specific around our research. So, for example, in terms of women, I was really excited at the Cure Parkinson's Trust. I was asked to be on a patient panel. There's two women presenting, and I knew I was going to forget their names, but one of them is doing, she's actually speaking on a panel here. I'll maybe have to give you the name afterwards.
Yeah, I will put them in the
it's just gone
description.
out of my head. Coming up to next pill time. It's gone out of my head. But anyway, she's done research on using a anti-inflammatory that's normally used in, inflammatory bowel disease. Mm-hmm. And when they did the trial, they used this anti-inflammatory drug. They didn't meet their endpoints, in terms of improvement. But when they looked at women separate to men, they did meet their endpoints. Mm. So I was like, so where's the next funding going to be so you can actually extend that out? And she was actually contemplating what she was going to do. And I was like, if that was the outcome in men, you would have the funding to do that research. So we need to start looking at the differences, disaggregating the data and looking at the difference between men and women and their response to drugs. Because it makes sense if we absorb differently, we probably respond differently to the medication. So, and women have a lot higher levels of inflammatory conditions than men, particularly postmenopausal. So it makes sense that anti-inflammatories might potentially have more benefit in us than men. So that's what I would say is the challenge, is actually to start being more, not lumping us all together, being more specific. And, also in the case of young onset, we know that the prevalence of, so at the moment it's sort of 60-40 men to women is kind of the ratio. But in young onset, under the age of 40, it's actually more 1-to-1. Mm. Why is that? Why is it the same between men and women younger onset? It's taking the hormones out of the picture because, it's not, because usually women get diagnosed later, and that's probably because the hormones are more neuroprotective until they're postmenopausal. So what is it about the younger onset group if it's not the hormones? So I think there needs to be a lot more research in the younger onset, might answer a lot of questions as to why Parkinson's starts in the first place. It's not just genetic, because only about 10 to 20% of young onset are genetic. So yeah, I think there are two questions I'd be saying. So being more specific, rather than just a catch-all research.
Richelle Flanagan, thank you from the bottom of my heart for making the time, for giving this fantastic interview and conversation. I think you help so many people just by being here. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks very much for having me. And you've done a lot by interviewing all these people, and I'll be looking forward to listening to all the podcasts myself.
It's going to be interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks a million.